Now that is the main thing I need for you to know from Meditation 3, that Descartes gives what he takes to be a persuasive theistic argument. We don't ourselves have to decide whether that's a good argument. For our purposes, it's enough to understand Descartes that he gives what he takes to be a persuasive one, because that's an important piece of background for what happens in Meditation 4. In Meditation 4, he provides what you might think of, so to speak, as a new rule of logic, a new kind of inference rule, which he states as follows on page 36. Whatever I clearly and distinctly perceive must be true. And his idea there requires some unpacking, so I want to do that now. Descartes has the following really interesting idea. Let's now assume, on Descartes' behalf, in order to understand where he's coming from, that a GCB exists. And Descartes points out that ignorance is a kind of evil. That is to say, if there's some way in which I've fallen short of some reasonable standard, it's when I am ignorant or in error about some fact of the matter. Now, it might be that the evil that corresponds to my ignorance or error is not as extreme as if I were intentionally to cause somebody harm, or undermine somebody's credibility, or lie to them, or in some way exploit them. So, this notion of evil might not conform to either our definition of physical or moral evil, but Descartes seems to make a reasonable point in saying that in a way, being wrong or just being ignorant about something because I just don't have an opinion about it all is a form of evil. It's a way in which I'm lesser than I might have been because I'd be more if I had knowledge about at least some significant matter. So for Descartes, error is a kind of evil, but he also points out that God, being an omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent being and so on, would not permit intractable evil, that is, evil that cannot be improved upon or otherwise justified. So if error is a kind of evil, and God, being a GCB, would not permit any intractable evil, then the following seems to hold. If I use my faculties in the most careful, rigorous, self-critical, circumspect way, then if I find myself coming to a conclusion, then that conclusion must also be true. That conclusion must also be correct. So again, the idea is, suppose I'm doing a mathematical calculation, and I'm doing my absolute level best to not make any errors. I check my work multiple times. I make sure I've got all the formulas right. I make sure my calculator is working properly, and if I have any doubts about it, I'll calculate things by hand. I double check and triple check my work, and I get to a certain conclusion. That, for example, there's a certain amount in my friend's checking account, or that the slope of a line is thus and so. The idea of clear and distinct perception is that if I do my intellectual best in coming to that conclusion, then given that error, if I were to have made an error, I would have been involved in a kind of evil. In that case, the error could not have been my fault. And Descartes assumes that, therefore, assuming that I'm not taking anybody else's word for anything, I'm not following anybody's words on trust or their testimony, I'm just thinking things through on my own, Descartes says, well, if I still end up being in error, then it would have to be God's fault. But if that were the case, then God would be responsible for a kind of evil which contradicts the nature of a GCB. So the thought is, clear and distinct perception is supposed to be a way in which if I do my absolute intellectually most rigorous, my very best in coming to a conclusion, then the GCB would not let me fall into error, because it wouldn't be my fault in that case if I had been doing my best. It must therefore be the GCB's fault, but that contradicts the GCB's nature, and therefore, just as a law of inference, for example, that says if A equals B and B equals C, we can infer that A equals C, so too, here's a new law of inference or rule of inference that Descartes wants to propound. If I do my intellectual level best and I come to a conclusion, I'm doing my absolute best I can epistemically, then Descartes would not, let me try it again, God would not let me fall into error, therefore that conclusion must be correct.